7 years of fear, terror, and torment. For 7 long years, Cindy James was hunted by whom we still don't know. But here's the chilling part. When she was found, bound, and drugged, her death wasn't ruled a murder. It was ruled an accident, or perhaps even a suicide. How does that happen? What went wrong? Today, we unravel one of the most unsettling and controversial mysteries ever to come out of Vancouver, the case of Cindy James, a woman haunted by an invisible predator until her very last breath. Was it foul play, or was Cindy, in her own tragic way, the architect of her demise? Let's dive into this tangled web of deception, fear, and death. Cindy James was a 44-year-old nurse living in Vancouver, British Columbia. Known to those around her as kind, caring, and perhaps a little quiet, Cindy's life on the surface seemed ordinary. But beneath that calm exterior was a woman gripped by an inexplicable horror. For 7 years, she reported receiving threatening letters, menacing phone calls, and at times physical attacks. The harassment was relentless and unpredictable, driving her deeper into fear and paranoia. Despite numerous police reports, investigations, and even private detectives, no one could definitively say who or what was tormenting Cindy. Then, in June of 1989, Cindy was found dead under circumstances so bizarre that even seasoned investigators were left baffled. Her hands and feet were bound, and she was drugged with lethal doses of morphine and diazepam. Yet, despite the evidence, her death was not ruled a homicide. Authorities closed the case, labeling it either an accident or a suicide. But can someone really bind themselves, inject fatal drugs, and walk miles before collapsing? It's been over. Before the terror began, Cindy James led what most would consider a quiet, fulfilling life. Born as Cynthia Hack, she grew up in a loving household, the daughter of Otto and Matilda Hack. Cindy had always been someone who sought to care for others, which led her down the path of nursing, a profession she was deeply passionate about. By the time she was in her 40s, Cindy had established herself as a respected nurse in Vancouver, British Columbia, known for her dedication to her patients and her calm, compassionate demeanor. In her personal life, Cindy was often described as reserved but friendly, with a soft spoken nature that endeared her to those around her. Despite her gentle personality, there was a strength to Cindy, a quiet determination that made her successful in her career and admired by her colleagues. At one point, she had been married to a prominent psychiatrist, Dr. Roy Makepeace. The marriage, however, didn't last, and in 1981, after 16 years together, Cindy and Roy divorced. Though they remained in contact, their relationship was complicated, and some of Cindy's closest friends believed that Roy's presence in her life would continue to haunt her long after their separation. Cindy had a small but close-knit circle of friends, many of whom would become crucial figures in her story as the harassment unfolded. Agnes Woodcock and Tom Woodcock, Cindy's dearest friends, often stood by her side during her most difficult times. Her bond with them would be tested as they witnessed Cindy's life unraveling in the years to come. But before 1982, Cindy's life seemed peaceful, almost idyllic. She lived alone, worked hard, and had a social network of people who cared for her. However, beneath this calm exterior, a storm was brewing, and in the coming years, Cindy would face a terror that no one could have predicted. It all began in 1982. Cindy James had just finalized her divorce from Roy Makepeace, and while life after her marriage wasn't perfect, nothing could have prepared her for the dark turn it was about to take. One day, Cindy received a letter in her mailbox, simple, nondescript, yet deeply unsettling. The message was cryptic but threatening, written in a way that made Cindy feel immediately unsafe. This wasn't just a prank or a misunderstanding. It was a clear warning, and it chilled her to the bone. Soon, it wasn't just letters. The phone calls started. Short, strange calls filled with silence, breathing, or occasionally whispered threats. At first, Cindy tried to brush it off, hoping it was some sick joke that would stop if she ignored it. But the letters kept coming, and the phone calls became more frequent, more insidious. She told her close friends about it, and naturally, they were alarmed. Why would someone target Cindy? Who could be behind this? Cindy's life had always been low profile, and no one could think of a reason why she would have an enemy. But the letters were undeniable, and they were getting more frequent. Cindy couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, always lurking in the shadows. She went to the police, reporting the incidents. To her, these weren't random acts of intimidation. This was the start of something much worse. The police took note of her concerns, but without a clear suspect or any physical harm, their response was cautious. They advised Cindy to be vigilant, but there wasn't much more they could do. Cindy, however, felt an increasing sense of dread. The threats were not empty. She felt certain that whoever was behind this wanted to harm her. And as the months dragged on, the sense of fear grew stronger. By the end of 1982, Cindy's situation had escalated far beyond mere letters and phone calls. The harassment took a more sinister turn, and Cindy's life became a nightmare. The letters she received started to contain disturbing and violent imagery, threats that were no longer veiled in subtlety. They promised harm and worse to her. Cindy was now receiving calls at all hours of the night, sometimes with nothing but eerie silence on the other end, other times with menacing voices that whispered her name or made threats that sent chills down her spine. It wasn't just psychological torment, things began to happen around her home. Cindy would return to find her lights turned off, her phone lines cut, and strange objects placed around her property. One evening, Cindy discovered dead cats left in her yard. On another occasion, a strange man was spotted lurking near her house. Every moment was filled with the sense that she was being watched, followed, hunted. Cindy's friends, Agnes and Tom, were horrified. They supported her, insisting she go to the police, which she did multiple times. But the police, although sympathetic, were growing skeptical. There was little concrete evidence to go on, and some officers began to question whether Cindy might be exaggerating or worse, creating the events herself. It was a thought Cindy's friends refused to entertain, knowing how terrified she had become. She wasn't making this up. Still, the authorities couldn't ignore the escalating incidents. Cindy was assaulted on several occasions, found bound and gagged in her own home, claiming to have been attacked by an unknown assailant. But each time there were no signs of forced entry, and the police struggled to find any concrete evidence of who might be behind these attacks. To protect herself, Cindy began taking self-defense classes and even hired a private investigator, hoping that someone outside the official investigation might take her seriously and find the person responsible. She installed a security system in her home, changed her locks multiple times, and even moved houses, but no matter what she did, the terror followed her. Her life became a twisted cycle of fear, as if the harasser was always one step ahead, knowing her every move. Cindy's nightmare had only just begun, and with each passing day, it became clearer that whoever was tormenting her wasn't going to stop. The terror that haunted Cindy James reached a chilling climax in the form of several disturbing physical attacks. Over the years, there were multiple instances where Cindy was found tied up, bruised, and seemingly drugged. Each time, the scenario appeared as if she had been the victim of a brutal assault. Yet, there was something off, something that raised more questions than answers. In one incident, Cindy was found in her garage, hands and feet bound, with a nylon stocking tightly wrapped around her neck. She claimed to have been attacked, knocked unconscious, and left there by her tormentor. But the police could find no signs of forced entry, no evidence of an intruder. How had Cindy managed to survive this repeated trauma? Could someone really do this to her and leave no trace? The skeptics began to surface. Authorities started to question whether these attacks were self inflicted, as hard as that was for her friends to believe. How could someone tie themselves up in such a meticulous manner? And if these attacks were staged, why would Cindy do it? Despite the horror of each incident, the lack of concrete evidence led many investigators to doubt her story. Some believed that Cindy was inflicting the injuries upon herself, as impossible as that seemed, to gain attention or because of a deep psychological need. Others believed she might have been experiencing a severe mental breakdown, causing her to both experience and perhaps fabricate these events. Cindy's friends, however, never doubted her. To them, the terror was real and they feared for her life. But the authorities' skepticism only grew, and as the physical attacks mounted, so did the tension between Cindy and the police. How could these events continue with no solid evidence of an attacker? It was as if Cindy was battling a ghost, an invisible enemy that only she could see. From the outset, the police were involved in Cindy's case. They took her reports seriously in the beginning, opening an investigation into the letters, the phone calls, and the escalating harassment. For a time, Cindy had the full support of law enforcement. She was assigned a police officer to monitor her case, and the authorities even installed surveillance outside her home to catch any potential intruders. But no one ever saw anything. The surveillance yielded no results, and the longer the investigation dragged on without tangible evidence, the more the police began to doubt Cindy's claims. Each time they responded to a report of an attack, they found Cindy disoriented, sometimes with superficial injuries, but no signs of forced entry or evidence of a struggle beyond her own account. The longer this went on, the more it strained the credibility of her story in the eyes of law enforcement. As the months turned into years, the police became increasingly suspicious. The turning point came after one particularly bizarre incident in which Cindy was found unconscious in her car with her hands and feet tied behind her back. Despite the severity of the situation, the police found no clues, no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no signs of a struggle. How had someone overpowered her, tied her up so efficiently, and left her without leaving a single trace? This is when the police began to seriously question whether Cindy was staging the attacks. It was easier to believe that Cindy had orchestrated the events herself than to accept that a criminal mastermind was somehow evading detection time and time again. The police weren't outright dismissing her, but their faith in her version of events had wavered. As far as they were concerned, Cindy's credibility was now at stake. As the investigation continued, Cindy's mental health became a focal point in the case. Years of living in fear had taken an undeniable toll on her well being. She had become increasingly paranoid, isolated, and withdrawn. Her friends noticed her drastic mood changes, and it was clear that the constant stress had pushed her to the edge. But the question remained, was Cindy paranoid because she was being terrorized, or was her paranoia feeding into a narrative that wasn't fully grounded in reality? Mental health professionals who evaluated Cindy during this time offered conflicting views. Some believed that Cindy was indeed suffering from a psychological disorder, possibly even a form of dissociative disorder, where she might have been unconsciously harming herself. Others believed that her paranoia was justified, that she was indeed a victim of harassment, and that the lack of evidence didn't mean there wasn't an attacker. The police leaned more towards the theory that Cindy's mental health issues were playing a significant role in her story. Their doubts about her credibility had now morphed into a belief that Cindy was not only an unreliable witness, but potentially her own worst enemy. They began to question whether the entire narrative of harassment was a result of her deteriorating mental state. Cindy herself had been reluctant to admit that she might need psychological help. For years, she insisted that the attacks were real, that someone was after her, and that her life was in constant danger. To her, the police's growing skepticism was not just frustrating but deeply insulting. She felt abandoned by the very people who were supposed to protect her. This tug of war between Cindy's claims and the doubts surrounding her mental health would shape the remainder of the investigation. While her friends continued to believe her, the police were now leaning towards a much darker conclusion that Cindy might have been orchestrating her own terror all along, driven by an underlying mental health crisis. But if that was true, how do you explain the increasing severity of the attacks? Was Cindy really capable of doing all of this to herself, or was there someone else lurking in the shadows, taking advantage of her fragile state? Throughout Cindy's torment, there was one constant in her life: the unwavering support of her close friends and family. Her most trusted friends, Agnes and Tom Woodcock, believed Cindy wholeheartedly. They had seen the toll the harassment was taking on her, watched as she became increasingly frail and anxious, and they knew without a doubt that she was in genuine danger. Agnes had even discovered Cindy in one of her most vulnerable moments, finding her tied up and bruised, a stocking wrapped around her throat after one of the so-called attacks. For Agnes and Tom, these incidents were not staged. They were real, terrifying, and evidence of the physical and psychological trauma that Cindy was enduring. Cindy's family, particularly her father, Otto Hack, was equally convinced that someone was targeting his daughter. He had seen how the once vibrant and caring woman had been reduced to living in constant fear. Cindy's behavior changed over the years. She became paranoid, jumpy, and distrustful of anyone outside her inner circle. Otto and her mother, Matilda, stood by her side, frustrated by the lack of progress in the investigation and the growing skepticism from the authorities. They believed the police had failed Cindy by not taking her claims seriously enough. Cindy's friends and family also grew increasingly frustrated with the police's handling of the case. To them, it seemed as though the authorities were more interested in proving that Cindy was unstable or fabricating the events than in actually finding out who was behind the harassment. The police's reluctance to fully investigate every incident only deepened the chasm between Cindy's supporters and law enforcement. Cindy's loved ones couldn't comprehend why the police seemed to downplay the significance of the letters, the attacks, and the psychological toll it was taking on Cindy. To her friends and family, Cindy's fears were legitimate, and they did everything they could to help her. They were her lifeline, the ones she turned to in her darkest moments. But despite their best efforts, it seemed that nothing could stop the terror that followed Cindy wherever she went. Cindy's life over those years was filled with one strange and disturbing incident after another. Time and time again, bizarre things happened that no one could quite explain. Cindy frequently reported that her phone lines had been cut, her home ransacked, and threatening messages left for her in places where no one but an intruder could have left them. One night, Cindy returned home to find a note pinned to her door with a knife. It wasn't just the message itself that was disturbing, but the sheer audacity of the intruder who had been bold enough to leave such a blatant threat. In another incident, her car was found vandalized with grotesque messages scrawled across it. Dead cats were left on her property, their presence a sinister warning. How could anyone fake such a series of events? Then there were the times Cindy was found tied up, gagged, and bruised. On more than one occasion, she was discovered in a semi-conscious state, claiming she had been drugged and attacked. She had no memory of the incidents, only the terror that lingered afterward. One of the most baffling occurrences took place when Cindy was found in her garage with her hands and feet bound tightly behind her back. The situation was so strange that it raised serious questions. How could someone bind themselves in such a way? Was it really possible that Cindy had done this to herself? For the police, these incidents defied explanation. There was no clear evidence pointing to an external attacker. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no signs of forced entry. But the sheer number of these events made it difficult to believe that Cindy was capable of orchestrating them all by herself. Yet that's exactly what some investigators began to suspect. If Cindy was staging these attacks, she had to be a mastermind. But why would she do this? And if someone else was behind it, how could they remain so elusive? Cindy's friends and family refused to believe that she was capable of staging such elaborate and dangerous incidents. To them, the possibility that Cindy was doing this to herself was absurd. But as the years dragged on without a clear culprit, the police's skepticism only grew, leaving Cindy's loved ones caught between their unwavering belief in her and the increasing doubts from law enforcement. June 8th, 1989, marked the day that Cindy James' story came to its tragic and mysterious end. After 7 years of living in constant fear, Cindy's body was discovered in a vacant lot near an abandoned house in Vancouver. She had been missing for over 2 weeks. Her body was found in a grotesque and unsettling condition. Her hands and feet were bound behind her back, and a nylon stocking was wrapped tightly around her neck. Her clothes were ripped, and it was clear she had been drugged with lethal doses of morphine and diazepam. The scene was eerie, almost staged, but it raised the same question that had plagued the investigation for years. How could Cindy have done this to herself? The medical examiner concluded that the cause of death was an overdose, but no one could explain how she could have administered such a high dose of morphine, tied herself up, and then made her way to the location where her body was found. Shockingly, despite the disturbing circumstances of her death, the coroner ruled it an accidental death with the possibility of suicide. This ruling stunned Cindy's friends, family, and the public. How could her death be labeled an accident? Was it really possible that Cindy had orchestrated this final act herself, or had her tormentor finally carried out their deadly plan? The media was quick to pick up the story, turning Cindy's case into a sensational mystery. Headlines across Vancouver and beyond questioned whether Cindy was the victim of foul play or if her death was the result of years of mental anguish and paranoia. Public opinion was divided. Some believed that Cindy had been terrorized to the point of breaking, while others were convinced that she had orchestrated the events, including her own death. For those who had loved Cindy, the idea of her taking her own life in such a horrific way was unfathomable. They believed someone had finally gotten to her, that the harassment had culminated in murder. But for the police, the evidence didn't support a clear conclusion of homicide. And so, the case of Cindy James, a woman who had been hunted for years by a ghostly tormentor, was officially closed with no definitive answers. Her death left more questions than answers, and over 3 decades later, the case still haunts investigators, friends, and true crime enthusiasts. Cindy's life, filled with terror, ended in a mystery that, to this day, remains unsolved. When Cindy Jane's body was discovered, the disturbing condition in which she was found immediately raised alarms. Tied up with a nylon stocking around her neck and showing no signs of external struggle, it was clear something unusual had happened. But it was the toxicology report that truly deepened the mystery. The autopsy revealed that Cindy had lethal levels of morphine and diazepam in her system, two potent substances that would have incapacitated her long before she could have tied herself up in the manner she was found. The question everyone asked was, how could Cindy have managed to inject herself with a fatal dose of morphine, bind her hands and feet, and then walk or crawl to the vacant lot where her body was discovered? The sheer logistics of such an act seemed impossible. Yet, the official ruling on her death was neither homicide nor suicide. It was labeled an accidental death, a decision that left both investigators and Cindy's loved ones deeply puzzled. The coroner suggested that Cindy may have injected herself with the drugs as part of a staged event that went tragically wrong, or she might have been attempting suicide. However, the fact that her body was found bound complicated any straightforward narrative. The lack of defensive wounds and evidence of a struggle only added to the confusion. Could someone have drugged her and left her in this state, or was it truly possible that Cindy had carried out this elaborate act herself? These questions, crucial to understanding her death, were never satisfactorily answered, and the ruling of an accidental death seemed more of a compromise than a conclusion. Many people close to Cindy, and even those who followed her case from the outside, believed without a doubt that foul play was involved. To them, it seemed far fetched to think that Cindy could have staged her own death in such an elaborate way. Over the years, Cindy had claimed repeatedly that someone was after her, that she was being stalked, harassed, and tormented. To those who believed her, her death was the culmination of years of psychological torture, and her tormentor had finally carried out the ultimate act of violence. The most common theory of foul play centered around the idea that Cindy had a stalker, an unknown figure who had been watching her for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. Her friends, including Agnes and Tom Woodcock, were convinced that someone had been terrorizing Cindy. They pointed to the threatening letters, the phone calls, the dead animals left on her property, and the numerous incidents of harassment. To them, the police had simply failed to catch the person responsible. There were also those who suspected that someone closer to Cindy had been involved. Her ex-husband, Dr. Roy Makepeace, was a person of interest in many conversations about Cindy's death. Their marriage had ended on strained terms, and while Roy had maintained contact with Cindy, their relationship was far from amicable. Some wondered if Roy had the motive and means to harm Cindy, but there was never any solid evidence to link him to her death. For others, the theory of foul play extended to a larger conspiracy. Could it have been more than one person? Could someone within Cindy's social circle or even within law enforcement have been involved in orchestrating the harassment and ultimately her death? While these theories remained speculative, they continued to fuel the belief that Cindy James did not die by her own hand, but rather at the hands of someone who had been haunting her for years. In stark contrast to the theory of foul play was the theory that Cindy had taken her own life. For the police, this became a more plausible explanation as the years went by without any concrete evidence of an attacker. They suggested that Cindy might have been orchestrating the harassment herself, fabricating the letters, phone calls, and even the physical attacks as a result of severe psychological distress. The argument was that Cindy had been battling profound mental health issues, possibly driven by loneliness or trauma, and that her death was the final tragic act in a series of self-inflicted events. Supporters of the suicide theory pointed to the autopsy report, particularly the high levels of morphine and diazepam in Cindy's system. Could this have been her final attempt to stage another incident, only to accidentally take too much of the drugs and succumb to the effects? If so, it might explain why she was found bound and gagged, an elaborate setup that had spiraled out of her control. But this theory was met with skepticism from Cindy's friends and family. How could a woman bind herself in such a way after administering a fatal dose of morphine, and why would she continue to inflict such extreme torment upon herself for years, putting her life and mental health at risk? To those closest to Cindy, the idea that she had staged her own death was not only unlikely but offensive. They believed her struggles were rooted in genuine fear, not mental illness. The suicide theory, however, remained the police's most accepted conclusion. It painted a picture of a woman so deeply affected by paranoia and fear that she had lost touch with reality, leading her to take drastic and ultimately fatal actions. But even within this theory, questions lingered. If Cindy had staged her own death, why was she found so far from her home? And how could she have predicted the outcome of such an intricate setup? The investigation into Cindy's death involved several key players, each with their own role in shaping the narrative of her case. At the heart of it was Cindy herself, a woman whose life was filled with both professional success and personal turmoil. But those around her, both friends and law enforcement, would become central figures in the investigation. Dr. Roy Makepeace, Cindy's ex-husband, was perhaps the most controversial figure in her story. As a psychiatrist, Roy was well versed in matters of mental health, and his strained relationship with Cindy only added to the suspicion surrounding him. He had denied any involvement in the harassment or Cindy's death, but many people close to Cindy were not so sure. Some of her friends even believed that Roy had the resources and the knowledge to carry out such an elaborate campaign of terror. However, despite these suspicions, Roy was never formally charged or considered a prime suspect. Agnes and Tom Woodcock, Cindy's loyal friends, were her most vocal supporters. They never wavered in their belief that Cindy was being targeted by an external force. Agnes, in particular, had been with Cindy through some of her darkest moments, even discovering her bound and bruised after one of the so-called attacks. To them, Cindy's fear was real, and they had no doubt that someone was out to harm her. Their frustration with the police's handling of the case was palpable. They felt that the authorities had failed Cindy at every turn. The police officers involved in the investigation also played a critical role in shaping the outcome of the case. Early on, they had taken Cindy's claims seriously, installing surveillance and assigning officers to monitor her situation. But as the evidence failed to materialize, their skepticism grew. By the time of Cindy's death, the police were convinced that she had staged many of the incidents herself, and their investigation reflected that belief. This skepticism influenced the course of the case, leading to a conclusion that left many of Cindy's loved ones dissatisfied. Each of these players contributed to the complex web of theories, suspicions, and unanswered questions surrounding Cindy's death. Whether they believed in foul play or suicide, their roles in the investigation shaped the legacy of one of Vancouver's most mysterious and haunting unsolved cases. Dr. Roy Makepeace, Cindy's ex-husband, was a figure of intrigue and suspicion throughout the investigation. As a well-respected psychiatrist, Roy had been a central figure in Cindy's life for over 16 years, but their relationship was far from stable. The couple divorced in 1981, a year before Cindy began experiencing the harassment that would dominate the remainder of her life. Despite the divorce, Roy remained in contact with Cindy, and this ongoing connection raised eyebrows, especially after the harassment escalated to terrifying levels. Several of Cindy's close friends, including Agnes Woodcock, harbored suspicions about Roy's involvement. They believed he might have had a hand in the campaign of terror that Cindy endured, pointing to the strained nature of their relationship and his potential desire to control or punish her. Roy's profession also played a role in these suspicions. As a psychiatrist, he would have had the knowledge and means to manipulate Cindy's mental state, potentially even gaslighting her into believing she was in more danger than she actually was. At one point, Cindy confided in friends that she believed Roy was behind the harassment, or at the very least knew more than he was letting on. Despite these fears, Cindy never took legal action against him, and no direct evidence was ever found to link Roy to the harassment or her death. In fact, Roy himself denied any involvement, maintaining that he had tried to help Cindy during her darkest moments. At one point, he even claimed to have received threatening phone calls as well, though there was never any concrete proof to back up these claims. The police interviewed Roy multiple times during the investigation, but never considered him a prime suspect. Despite the suspicions of Cindy's friends, Roy's role in her life and death remains one of the many unresolved elements of this case. To this day, there is no substantial evidence that connects him to the harassment, though many believe his influence on Cindy's mental state cannot be ignored. Cindy James' case is riddled with unanswered questions that continue to baffle those who investigate her death. Chief among these mysteries is the identity of the person who sent the threatening letters and made the menacing phone calls that terrorized Cindy for nearly a decade. Despite extensive investigations, the police were never able to trace the origin of the letters or calls, leaving the question of whether Cindy was truly being stalked or whether she was orchestrating the events herself. Another major mystery revolves around the circumstances of Cindy's death. If Cindy's death was truly a suicide, as the coroner's report suggested, how could she have tied herself up so intricately? Her hands and feet were bound behind her back, and a nylon stocking was wrapped tightly around her neck. While it's possible to imagine a scenario in which Cindy staged her own death, the logistics of such an act seem almost impossible to execute alone, especially after administering a lethal dose of morphine. The ruling of accidental suicide remains one of the most controversial aspects of the case. How could the coroner come to this conclusion despite the bizarre circumstances in which Cindy was found? The ruling implied that Cindy may have staged her own death as part of a suicide attempt gone wrong, but this theory left many of her loved ones unconvinced. To them, the ruling seemed more like a convenient way to close a case that had grown too complex to solve. Looking back at the evidence collected over the years, there are several key pieces that remain frustratingly ambiguous. The threatening letters, for instance, were examined for fingerprints, but none were ever found. The phone calls Cindy received were untraceable, and despite police surveillance on her home, no one was ever caught in the act of harassment. One particularly troubling piece of evidence was the lack of forensic clues at the scenes of Cindy's various attacks. When Cindy was found bound and gagged on multiple occasions, there were no signs of forced entry into her home, no fingerprints, and no clear evidence of a struggle. This absence of evidence fueled the police's theory that Cindy may have been fabricating the incidents. However, it also raises questions about whether the investigation overlooked potential leads that could have pointed to an external perpetrator. Could modern forensic techniques shed new light on the case today? Advances in DNA testing, digital forensics, and crime scene analysis might offer a chance to re examine some of the physical evidence. If the letters, for example, were tested for trace DNA, or if the phone records were reanalyzed with today's technology, it's possible that new information could emerge. Unfortunately, with the case long closed and much of the original evidence possibly lost or degraded, it's unclear whether a reinvestigation would yield any new results. The media played a significant role in shaping public perception of Cindy James' case. From the outset, her story captivated the public's imagination. After all, it wasn't every day that a seemingly ordinary nurse from Vancouver would become the target of a terrifying and mysterious campaign of harassment. The more bizarre the case became, the more media outlets sensationalized the story, often casting Cindy as either a tragic victim or an unreliable narrator of her own life. Newspapers and television reports were quick to emphasize the strange and unexplained nature of Cindy's death. The media focused heavily on the ruling of accidental suicide, with some outlets questioning whether the police had done enough to investigate the possibility of foul play. Others, however, leaned into the theory that Cindy had fabricated the harassment and had ultimately taken her own life in an elaborate final act. Public opinion was divided. Some people saw Cindy as a victim of a relentless stalker who had finally succeeded in ending her life. Others believed she had orchestrated the entire series of events as a way to seek attention or deal with personal demons. This media fueled divide has persisted to this day, with the case continuing to be a point of fascination for true crime enthusiasts and amateur sleuths alike. Over the years, numerous alternative theories have emerged about what really happened to Cindy James. One of the most popular theories among amateur sleuths is that Cindy was indeed the victim of a long-term stalker, possibly someone from her past who had remained hidden in the shadows for years. This theory suggests that the police may have overlooked a key suspect or failed to connect the dots between seemingly unrelated incidents. Another theory posits that Cindy's death was the result of an organized effort, perhaps a group of people working together to terrorize her and ultimately drive her to her death. This theory, while more far-fetched, attempts to explain how Cindy could have been targeted for so long without anyone being caught. There's also the possibility that Cindy was being manipulated by someone close to her, perhaps even her ex-husband, Dr. Roy Makepeace. If Roy had been involved in some way, his knowledge of psychology could have been used to gaslight Cindy into believing she was in danger, ultimately pushing her towards a tragic end. Each of these theories highlights the complexity of the case and the gaps left by the official investigation. While none of these alternative theories have been proven, they serve as a reminder that Cindy's death is still shrouded in mystery, with countless questions left unanswered. As we come to the end of Cindy James' story, one thing is abundantly clear. The truth behind her death remains as elusive today as it was over 3 decades ago. Whether Cindy was the victim of foul play, a tragic figure driven to take her own life by years of relentless harassment, or a woman battling her own demons, the case remains unsolved. Cindy's death has left a trail of questions that will likely never be fully answered. Who sent the letters? Was she truly being stalked, or was her mind playing tricks on her? How could she have tied herself up and injected herself with a fatal dose of morphine? And perhaps most haunting of all, did the authorities fail Cindy in her time of need, or was this a case where the answers were simply too complicated to uncover? For now, we leave you with these questions, inviting you to draw your own conclusions. Was Cindy James the target of a malevolent force, or did her own mind lead her to a tragic and premature end? The answers may be out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the day when the full truth is finally revealed. Until then, Cindy's case remains one of the most perplexing and haunting mysteries of our time.